Hey friends, this is Pastor Joe from Southwest Lutheran Church, and I'm here to share our second session of Biblical Diversity, Race, and Racism. This is a class we've been doing in adult education, having great conversations. In our first session, we talked about the origin of humans, right? There is one humanity in the world, according to the biblical story, and we equally share the image of God. We're all equally human. And this kind of takes away one of the big justifications for the ideas behind racism, right? Which is the idea that there's different kinds of humans, different races of humans in the world. In fact, we can say, according to the biblical story, we are one humanity. And that has a lot to say about how we treat one another, how we speak about one another and think about one another. Now, this isn't to say that we can't talk about things like race or racism, because these are features of our world today. It's good for us to think about how some people may be mistreated, or some people maybe have more opportunities than others. And it's good for us to address those things in a biblical way. We're getting ahead of ourselves, though. So today we're thinking about Genesis chapter 11. If there is just one humanity, well then how do we get different kinds of people, different languages, different cultures in the world? And this is what we see in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 11, and the Tower of Babel. And here's how the story goes. At that time, this is just after the flood, there is one group of people in the world, and they're moving out, but they're all staying together, and they find a place where they all want to stay together and build a city there. And not only that, they want to build themselves a tower to make a name for themselves. They want to build themselves a symbol to rally around. And the point of this tower seems to be so that all the people, no matter where you're at, you can look, you can see this tower, and you can stick together as one group, one community. Now that sounds good, but there's a problem with it, because back in the Garden of Eden, the command that God had given to humanity was that they were supposed to spread out into the world. They were supposed to fill the world and subdue it. They were supposed to have dominion over it. Really, they were supposed to be God's representatives in every part of the world. And by sticking together in one place, they would be ignoring that command, ignoring that desire of God. The Tower of Babel incident, it's really interesting because I know I've heard a lot of traditional interpretations of this. It says people were basically being prideful in building the tower. And it's interesting because when I read the text, I don't really get that. They're just building a tall tower. And the point is never stated to be, let's make ourselves great. Let's make think highly of ourselves. Let's make ourselves equal with God, because that's kind of how the traditional interpretation goes. Let's build a tower up to heaven so we can be as high as God. That's not really what the text says, but what the people do say in Genesis chapter 11 is they say, let's build ourselves a tower. Let's make a name for ourselves here so that we will be together. That seems to be their goal. But that contradicts God's desire of wanting them to go and bear His image across the whole world. So what does God do? He comes and He scatters the people. He confuses their languages so they can't speak to one another. And then if we back up to Genesis chapter 10, we see what we call the Table of Nations. And according to that, it seems to be that then people spread out into the world according to different groups, different families, different tribes, different clans. And so they spread out, and the goal of having people begin to move out into the world to fill it is accomplished. That process is set in motion. And this is where we say this looks like the origin of cultural, ethnic, national, family diversity in the Bible story, is that God sends people out. He makes it so they can't stick together. And this indeed is one way of producing diversity in the world. God sends these people out to be different from one another, because that's the natural and logical consequence of forming them into smaller groups that aren't going to be able to contact one another. It's kind of a cool thing. And so this is the origin of biblical diversity. Now, this is not to say that diversity is a result of sin. That would be the wrong message to take from this. And in fact, that's what we're going to see in our next session, when we talk about this, our third session, we're looking then at Revelation chapter 7. And as we see there, it's not that diversity is somehow a sin or an error or a chaotic bit of the creation that needs to be corrected. Diversity is actually God's plan. This is God's intention for his people, the church. Indeed, it's God's plan for humanity. So that's what we get to see next time. I can't wait to talk about it with you. Until then, God bless. Take care.